Let's start with a hypothetical. I mean, imagine a drunk driver standing right next to a burning wreckage of a car.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. So a police officer walks up, notepad in hand, and the driver looks them dead in the eye and says, my car has been associated with crashing into a tree.
Wow. Yeah, they definitely don't say, I drove it off a cliff.
Exactly. They completely blame the car. They adopt this bizarre, I don't know, this passive voice, like they were just a bystander to a tragedy they couldn't possibly control.
It's wild you bring that up because that is practically verbatim the defense strategy used during the congressional hearings for the opioid crisis.
Oh, really? The Sackler family hearings?
Yeah, exactly. The committee subpoenaed members of the Sackler family, the makers of OxyContin, and the politicians were pressing them hard, basically demanding an apology for their role in a crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Which, you would think warrants some accountability.
You'd think. But one of the family members, a young man who had sat on the board of directors, he finally speaks up. And he refuses to admit any legal wrongdoing, but he says he takes moral responsibility.
Okay, that sounds like a step.
We'll wait for the phrasing. He says, I believe our product, OxyContin, despite our best intentions and best efforts, has been associated with abuse and addiction.
It has been associated with.
Right.
It's just so infuriating because it's completely detached. And the thing is, we do this all the time with social epidemics.
We really do. We treat them like weather events.
Yeah, exactly. Like a crime wave or a virus or, a teen suicide cluster. We talk about them like they're hurricanes, like you just board up your windows and pray it doesn't hit your house.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. Because Malcolm Gladwell's book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, is basically a forensic investigation into why that passive voice is a total lie.
Right. Our mission today is to prove that epidemics don't just happen. We engineer them. Sometimes by accident, but honestly, often on purpose. There are culprits and contexts and these hidden rules that drive everything.
And once you stop looking at epidemics as, acts of nature and start looking at them as engineered events, the entire landscape completely changes.
You stop asking, why did this happen? And you start asking, who built the conditions for this to happen?
Exactly. And a perfect example of this is Los Angeles in the late 1980s and early 90s. It was, without question, the bank robbery capital of the world.
Oh, the numbers are just staggering.
They really are. In 1992 alone, LA experienced 2,641 bank robberies.
Which averages out to a bank robbery every 45 minutes of the banking day.
Just relentless.
It's an insane volume of crime. And the FBI was completely overwhelmed.
And the characters driving this chaos were straight out of a movie. You had the Yankee Bandit, the Marx Brothers, the Miss America Bandit.
Right. But the true architect of the whole meltdown was a 23-year-old gang member named Robert Sheldon Brown.
Right, Casper.
Casper, yeah. His street name was Casper. And he and his partner, Sea-Dog, they barely ever set foot inside a bank themselves.
Which is brilliant, honestly, in a dark way. Casper realized the riskiest part of robbing a bank was just walking through the front door. So he essentially became a franchise manager for armed robbery.
He outsourced the labor. He would recruit local teenagers, sometimes literally pulling them out of middle school during their nutrition breaks.
It's just wild to think about, kids on their snack break.
Yeah, and he taught them this technique he called going kamikaze. You bust in with assault rifles, you fire at the ceiling, scream to paralyze the room, grab the cash, and jump into a stolen getaway car.
All while Casper is sitting in a separate clean car blocks away, safely managing the whole operation over a two-way radio.
And if his young recruits got caught, well, he just recruited new kids the next day. He orchestrated something like 175 bank robberies using this exact method.
Casper basically treated crime like a scalable startup. He totally systematized the chaos. But, the puzzle here isn't just Casper's ingenuity.
Right.
It's why his specific method caught fire and triggered a massive citywide meltdown, while other, much more famous criminals never sparked any kind of trend at all.
If fame and charisma were the things that drive human behavior, the epidemic should have been started 50 years earlier by Willie Sutton.
Oh, Willie Sutton is a legend.
He really is. He was a massive celebrity in New York in the 40s and 50s. He dated starlets. He wore these elaborate master disguises, broke out of prison multiple times.
And he robbed banks with this kind of terrifying charm, right?
Exactly. He never fired a shot. He would just talk his way into the vault. People literally made movies about him. Yet Willie Sutton triggered absolutely nothing. Nobody copied him.
Right. There was no Sutton-style robbery epidemic sweeping New York, but Casper, operating entirely in the shadows, triggers a citywide contagion.
So why the difference? Why does Casper light the match, but Willie Sutton doesn't?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the first hidden rule of social engineering. Willie Sutton failed to start an epidemic because he was operating in the wrong environment.
The wrong environment, meaning the city itself.
Yeah, to figure out why LA caught fire and New York didn't, we have to look at something epidemiologists call small area variation.
Okay, break that down for us.
So in 1967, a physician named John Wenberg was studying medical spending in Vermont. He mapped out the state into these different hospital districts and looked at the rates of various common surgeries.
Like tonsillectomies and stuff?
Exactly. And he looked at two neighboring towns, Stowe and Waterbury. Now, demographically, these towns are identical. Same quaint 19th century buildings, same income brackets, same types of families.
So you'd expect their medical data to look pretty much the same.
Right. Yet in Stowe, 70% of the children had their tonsils removed by the time they were 15. In Waterbury, just a few miles away, only 20% did.
Wow, that's a massive gap. And it's not like the kids in Stowe magically had 3 times as many tonsil infections.
Exactly. The biology of the children was totally identical.
But the medical culture was vastly different.
Spot on. Wenberg expanded his research across New England and found these massive variations everywhere. Hysterectomies, prostate removals, hemorrhoid surgeries. The rates just swung wildly from one identical town to the next.
Because the doctors in a specific area develop a shared, localized belief system about what treatments work best.
Right. It's not a written hospital policy or anything. It's an invisible culture that completely dictates behavior.
It's basically like the canopy of a forest.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, Gladwell calls it an overstory. Like in a dense forest, the overstory is that uppermost layer of foliage. And its density, its height, how much light it lets through, that entirely dictates the behavior and development of every single plant and animal on the forest floor below.
Right. The ferns down at the bottom don't get to decide how much light they get.
Exactly. The overstory decides for them. And human communities do the exact same thing. We build these invisible canopies.
That's the perfect way to visualize it. Because LA in the 90s had an overstory primed for Casper's brand of chaos.
Right. You had the massive urban sprawl, the anonymity of the car culture.
And the physical layout, too. You had the proliferation of hundreds of new bank branches built right near freeway on-ramps for easy getaways. Plus, crucially, the established gang networks.
So in that specific overstory, recruiting teenagers to go kamikaze felt like a logical, normalized step. It just became the standard operating procedure.
Whereas Willie Sutton's New York had a completely different overstory. It was dense, it was pedestrian heavy, the banks were built like literal fortresses.
Right, a lone, charming gentleman robber made sense in that overstory, but it wasn't a scalable behavior that local teenagers could just easily replicate.
Exactly. So an overstory normalizes extreme behavior until it just feels like the weather to the people living inside it.
Taking out 70% of children's tonsils feels completely normal if you're a doctor in Stowe, Vermont.
Right.
And shooting an AK-47 into a bank ceiling feels normal if you're a teenager operating under Casper's overstory in LA.
And this brings us to one of the most chilling examples in the deep dive of a localized overstory turning deadly.
Yeah, this part of the research was incredibly tough to read.
It really is. Sociologists Seth Bruton and Anna Mueller conducted a deep dive study into a town they gave the pseudonym Poplar Grove.
Just to protect the privacy of the families there.
Right. And Poplar Grove is this beautiful, affluent community, highly ranked schools, state championship sports teams, incredible arts programs. It is a town totally built on achievement.
The kind of place people move to specifically for the schools.
Exactly. But Poplar Grove was experiencing a terrifying anomaly. They were seeing massive teenage suicide clusters.
Which is just heartbreaking.
Multiple deaths a year in a high school of just 2,000 students. It was vastly exceeding any statistical norm.
Because statistically, a school that size might see, what, 1 or 2 of those tragedies in a decade.
Right. But Poplar Grove lost over a dozen kids in that time frame, plus many more attempts. And the truly baffling part to the researchers was that these weren't the stereotypical outcasts.
Right, the kids who were dying were the stars of the town. They were the three-season athletes, the students with 4.0 GPAs, the ones with bubbly personalities, and Ivy League acceptance letters.
To understand how this happens in a town that looks like an absolute utopia, we have to map out the social architecture of a normal high school.
Okay, so normally it's pretty segmented, right?
Yeah, usually a high school is a diverse ecosystem. The researcher Bradford Brown created this famous chart-mapping high school crowds. You have the jocks, the nerds, the punks, the skaters.
Like a classic 80s teen movie.
Exactly. And in a normal school, there is a vast social distance between these groups. A punk has a completely different value system and definition of success than a prep.
Right. A bad grade might totally crush the prep, but the punk genuinely doesn't care.
Yeah.
That distance actually creates a psychological buffer.
But Poplar Grove compressed everyone into the exact same space. The researchers went in looking for the rebels, the kids who rejected the town's norms.
And what did they find?
They found a kid who dressed a bit differently, maybe skated, and listened to obscure music. But when they checked his academic record, he had a 4.0 and was agonizing over whether to attend MIT or Stanford.
Oh, wow. So even the alternative kids were deeply embedded in the achieving culture.
Exactly. In Poplar Grove, even the skaters and the punks were high-achieving perfectionists. The entire community had basically stripped away all diversity of thought, behavior, and definitions of success.
They built a monoculture.
They built a monoculture, and monocultures are uniquely fragile.
Because when you define success in only one extremely narrow, hyper-competitive way, failure becomes catastrophic.
Right. In Poplar Grove, the Overstory dictated that you had to be perfect. So when a high-achieving, popular student struggled secretly and tragically ended their life, the psychological shockwave was just profound.
The other students look at that and thought, if the perfect student couldn't survive the pressure here, how can I?
Exactly, because there were no alternative identities to fall back on. There was no punk identity that said, hey, school doesn't matter anyway. So the contagion just spread.
The Overstory offered no protective canopy at all. It just acted like a magnifying glass, focusing all that pressure.
And we actually see this exact same fragility in nature when you eliminate diversity to create a quote-unquote perfect specimen.
Right, the cheetah analogy. This blew my mind.
Zoologists learned this the hard way in the 1970s. Zookeepers started heavily investing in captive breeding programs for cheetahs. And suddenly, cheetahs were dying off in droves from a feline coronavirus called FIP.
It was an absolute bloodbath, right? Like an 80% mortality rate for the young cats.
Yeah, it was devastating. So geneticist Stephen O'Brien investigated, and he discovered a terrifying biological reality. Cheetahs are essentially genetic clones of each other.
Wait, really? All of them?
Pretty much. At the end of the Pleistocene epoch, the cheetah population experienced a massive bottleneck. They nearly went extinct.
Oh, so every single cheetah alive today is descended from just a tiny handful of survivors.
Exactly. They lack the genetic variation that protects other species. So when a single specific strain of a virus entered the captive population, it didn't just hit a few vulnerable animals, it hit all of them because biologically they were all the same animal.
Poplar Grove was essentially a psychological genetic bottleneck.
That's a great way to put it.
When a community strips away its internal diversity to curate this perfect homogeneous environment, they completely destroy their own resilience. Epidemics absolutely love monocultures.
Which forces us to ask the next logical question, right?
Right, monocultures are so dangerous. How much diversity does it actually take to change the culture of a group?
Because it's not just about throwing a few different people into the mix and hoping for the best. There is an actual mathematical tipping point for cultural change.
And this brings us to Rosabeth Moss Kanter.
Yes. In the 1970s, sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kanter studied a 300-person all-male sales force at a major corporation. And this company had recently hired a few women.
Okay. And how did it go?
Well, the women were highly qualified, but they were failing. And Kanter realized they were failing because of skewed proportions. They were being treated as symbols, not individuals.
It's what we call the neon shirt effect.
Right. Explain that for the listener.
So being a token in a workplace is like being the only person wearing a bright neon yellow shirt in a room full of people in black tie tuxedos.
Everyone sees you.
Exactly. Everyone sees the shirt, but nobody hears what the person wearing it is actually saying. You are hyper-visible as a category, but completely invisible as a contributor.
Kanter found that if you only have one or two women in a massive group of men, they don't change the culture at all. The culture either assimilates them or it just rejects them entirely.
But she discovered a threshold, didn't she?
She did. She looked at corporate boards and found a very distinct pattern. One woman on a 9-person board is a token. 2 women is a friendship. But 3 women out of 9 fundamentally transforms the entire culture of the board.
Because 3 out of 9 is a third.
Exactly. This is the magic third. Once a minority group hits roughly 33%, they lose the neon shirt. They become individuals again, and their voices actually begin to shift the dominant overstory of the group.
That's fascinating. And the researcher, Damon Santola, actually proved this mathematically, right?
Yeah, with a really clever experiment. He built a network of people playing this name-guessing game. They had to agree on a name for a face shown on a screen. Let's say they all organically agreed on the name Jeff.
Okay, everyone says it's Jeff.
Then Santola secretly introduced dissenters into the network who insisted the name was actually Pedro. He started with just a few dissenters.
And what happened?
Nothing happened. The group just totally ignored them. So he pushed the dissenters up to 20%.
Still nothing.
Still nothing. The majority held strong for Jeff, but the exact microsecond the dissenters hit 25%, what he calls the magic quarter, the entire consensus of the room flipped.
Just like that?
It wasn't gradual at all. It was instantaneous. The whole room suddenly agreed the name was Pedro.
That is wild. Santola's work basically shows that social change doesn't require a majority at all.
No, it just requires a committed critical mass, usually somewhere between 25 and 33%.
And once you understand this metric, you start seeing social engineers weaponizing it everywhere. Sometimes for incredibly noble reasons, but sometimes to fiercely protect the status quo.
Oh, absolutely. Let's look at the good side first, the Palo Alto Fair Play Committee in the 1940s.
Right. A group of progressive Quakers in California built a neighborhood called the Lawrence Tract, and their stated goal was to prevent white flight and build a truly integrated community.
And their method for doing this was mathematically ruthless. They engineered the neighborhood to be exactly 1/3 white, 1/3 black, and 1/3 Asian.
Because they understood the math. They knew that if any one group crept too high, the proportions would skew, the tipping point would be breached, and the integration would completely collapse.
They held this line so strictly that at one point they actually refused to sell a home to a desperate black family.
Wait, really? The Progressive Committee did that?
Yes, because selling to them would have pushed the black population slightly over the magic third. They prioritized the structural integrity of the overstory over the needs of an individual family.
Wow. It's a stark example of social engineering for a perceived greater good. But the exact same math is used by powerful institutions to keep minority groups safely below the tipping point.
Yes, and this explains one of the most bizarre athletic puzzles in higher education today, Harvard University's women's rugby team.
Right, because Harvard has a massive athletic program. They elevate these super niche sports like women's rugby, fencing, sailing, all to varsity status.
And you have to ask why. Why does a school known for academics need a massive varsity sailing team?
Because athletes are a protected admissions category. They get preferential treatment in the application process.
Exactly. And if you look at who actually plays varsity fencing, sailing, and squash, it's overwhelmingly wealthy, white, often legacy-adjacent students.
Right. So elevating these sports allows Harvard to admit a massive chunk of the student body under the guise of athletic recruitment, completely bypassing the standard academic meritocracy.
And the historical precedent for this is deeply, deeply cynical. In the 1920s, Harvard's president, A. Lawrence Lowell, was totally panicked because the Jewish student population was rising.
Oh, right. The quotas.
Yeah. He knew instinctively that if Jewish enrollment crossed a certain threshold, essentially the magic third, the dominant Protestant Brahmin culture of Harvard would kip. So he instituted policies to officially cap Jewish enrollment.
But today, Harvard isn't explicitly capping minorities in that same overt, written-down way, right?
No, but by allocating hundreds of admission slots to wealthy athletes in niche sports, they artificially inflate the dominant demographic. They manage the group proportions from the other side to ensure that no marginalized group ever crosses that 33% tipping point.
They use sports to guarantee their overstory remains unchallenged.
It's brilliant and incredibly insidious.
It really is. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've talked extensively about the number of people it takes to tip a culture. But what about the type of people?
Ah, yes. Because in some epidemics, a single person can do the work of thousands.
Right. In certain situations, all people are absolutely not created equal. Which brings us to February 2020.
The Marriott Long Wharf Hotel in Boston.
Exactly. Executives from the pharmaceutical company Biogen are gathering for a massive conference. And one person in that room, who researchers later dubbed Mr. Index, was unknowingly carrying the COVID-19 virus.
And that single individual in that single conference room triggered a chain of transmission that eventually resulted in over 300,000 global COVID infections.
Just a staggering number. 300,000 from one guy.
And for a long time, public health officials just couldn't explain it. How does one person infect a massive ballroom of people without, coughing directly in everyone's face or shaking hundreds of hands?
Right. The answer to that puzzle lies in aerosol science, specifically the work of aerosolists like William Risenpart and David Edwards.
Because early in the pandemic, we were totally obsessed with droplets, right?
Oh, yeah. Heavy particles of saliva that fall to the ground quickly. I remember people scrubbing their groceries with Clorox wipes and obsessing over standing exactly 6 feet apart at the store.
Exactly. But COVID wasn't primarily spreading through heavy droplets. It was spreading through aerosols. Light floating particles that behave less like spit and much more like cigarette smoke.
Right. And if someone is smoking in a ballroom, standing 6 feet away doesn't protect you at all.
Not even a little bit. The smoke fills the room, it rides the HVAC currents, and it lingers in the air for hours.
But even knowing it's an aerosol doesn't fully explain Mr. Index. I mean, why did he infect 300,000 people while most people who got COVID didn't infect anyone at all?
Well, because Mr. Index wasn't just infected. He was a biological superspreader, or, as scientists more accurately call it, a super emitter.
A super emitter.
Yeah, and we saw this clearly in a really famous 1970s case in Rochester, New York.
The measles outbreak.
Right. A single second-grade girl triggered a massive measles outbreak across 14 different classrooms.
But she didn't even go into those other classrooms, did she?
No, she didn't. She just breathed the air in the hallways and the cafeteria. And when researchers finally tracked her down and studied her, they found she exhaled 10 times more virus particles per breath than a normal infected person.
10 times. That's insane. And researchers now know that super-emitting isn't just some random fluke. There are specific biological and physiological traits that cause it.
Yeah, it's actually related to the viscosity of your saliva, your age, your BMI, and even how dehydrated you are on a given day.
I read the bubble wand analogy for this, and it made so much sense. If your vocal cords are dry and your saliva is sticky, they act like a tiny bubble wand. They snap and create these microscopic virus-laden aerosols every single time you exhale or speak.
Exactly. In the British COVID challenge study, where they actually intentionally infected healthy volunteers in a controlled environment to study them.
Which is wild that people volunteered for that.
I know, right? But they made a shocking discovery. 86% of all the virus particles in the air came from just 2 people out of the entire group.
Just 2 people. It is the ultimate Pareto principle. It's not Gladwell's law of the few from his first book. It's the law of the very, very, very few.
A tiny fraction of the population drives almost the entirety of the contagion. And, this creates an incredibly uncomfortable ethical dilemma for society.
It really does. Because if we can scientifically identify superspreaders, like if we know that high BMI or specific vocal cord physiology makes you a super emitter, what on earth do we do with that information?
Right. Imagine a movie theater during a pandemic outbreak.
Do we swab people's saliva at the door? Do we say, sorry, your saliva's too viscous today, you can't come in to see Batman?
Do we ban them from public spaces based on biology they literally cannot control?
It sounds like a dystopian sci-fi movie.
It does, but we actually ran into this exact moral wall years ago with environmental policy.
Oh, the Denver exhaust thing.
Yeah. A chemist named Donald Stedman developed an infrared emissions box. You could place it on a highway on-ramp in Denver, and as cars drove by, it would instantly read their exhaust and flash a big sign saying, good or poor.
Just instantly diagnosing the car.
Instantly. And Stedman discovered that just 5% of the cars on the road were causing 50% of the city's pollution.
They were mechanical superspreaders.
Exactly. So the logical policy would be to use the box to identify that 5%, pull them over, and force them to fix their cars or get off the road entirely.
But Denver refused to do it.
Totally refused. Politically, it was an absolute non-starter.
Because you can't single out a tiny, specific minority of people, who, by the way, are often poorer people driving older cars, and heavily penalize them, even if they are objectively causing half the problem.
Right. It violates our core sense of fairness. We prefer universal rules like making everyone get a smog check every 2 years, even though it's wildly inefficient compared to just targeting the 5%.
Epidemics force us into these terrible corners. The math tells us to target the superspreaders, but our morality tells us that singling people out is fundamentally wrong.
Which is why, when you combine a toxic overstory, mismanaged group proportions, and unchecked superspreaders, you get the ultimate forensic case of our time.
The American opioid crisis.
Yes. To dissect this tragedy, we really have to apply all three of Gladwell's hidden rules. Let's start with the overstory.
Okay, so demographer Jessica Ho charted global overdose deaths, and the data is blindingly clear. The opioid crisis is a uniquely American tragedy. We are completely off the charts compared to Europe or Asia.
But even inside America, there is massive small area variation. In the early days of the epidemic, Indiana's overdose death rate was twice that of neighboring Illinois.
Which is crazy because they share a border, they share similar demographics.
But their medical cultures were completely different. And that difference traces back to a totally forgotten drug warrior from the 1930s named Paul E. Madden.
Madden was the head of narcotics enforcement in California, right?
Yes, and he was deeply, deeply concerned about prescription drug abuse way back then. So he invented a regulatory system, the triplicate carbon copy prescription pad.
Meaning, if a doctor in California wanted to prescribe a strong narcotic, they couldn't just scribble it on a normal notepad.
Exactly. They had to write it on a special pad. One copy went to the patient, one went to the doctor's files, and the third copy went directly to the State Department of Justice.
It was a literal surveillance system. And it terrified doctors. Knowing the state was actively monitoring their narcotic prescriptions created a massive chilling effect.
And over the decades, states like New York, Illinois, and Texas adopted the triplicate system too. So the medical overstory in those states became one of extreme caution regarding opioids.
Okay, so fast forward to 1996. Purdue Pharma is getting ready to launch OxyContin.
Right. And they run focus groups and quickly realize that doctors in triplicate states are highly resistant to prescribing this powerful new drug.
The overstory of caution was too strong.
Exactly. So Purdue makes a strategic geographic decision. They largely bypass the triplicate states entirely, and they unleash their massive marketing machine on non-triplicate states, places like West Virginia, Nevada, and Maine.
They actively exploited the vulnerable overstories.
They did, but exploiting an overstory isn't enough to start a national fire of that scale. They needed superspreaders.
Right. Enter McKinsey & Company.
Yes. Purdue hired the consulting firm McKinsey to optimize their sales strategy. McKinsey analyzed all the data and told Purdue a hard truth. 50% of their sales calls were being totally wasted on doctors who were never going to prescribe high volumes of OxyContin.
Because most doctors are conservative with narcotics.
Right. So McKinsey advised Purdue to brutally focus their resources on what they called decile 8, 9, and 10 doctors.
The supercore.
The supercore. These were the medical equivalent of Mr. Index. They were superspreader physicians.
There was one of these doctors famously nicknamed the Candyman in his local community, who was putting nearly every patient who walked through his door on maximum dosages of OxyContin.
And Purdue didn't rein him in at all. They actively enabled him. Purdue sales reps visited doctors like the Candyman up to 24 times a year. They wined them, dined them, and showered them with perks.
They basically intentionally capitalized on a tiny fraction of outlier physicians to completely flood the market with pills. They found the superspreaders and just handed them megaphones.
It's horrifying. But the final fatal blow, the thing that turned a terrible prescription drug problem into the fentanyl bloodbath we have today, was a fundamental misunderstanding of group proportions.
Right, the reformulation in 2010.
Yes. Under massive public pressure, Purdue Pharma reformulated OxyContin. They introduced OxyContin OP. It was this new gummy bear-like pill that couldn't be crushed, snorted, or injected.
Now, on paper, making a highly addictive pill harder to abuse sounds like a triumph for public health. Like, finally, they did something good.
You would think so. But economists Powell and Pacula looked at the data and proved it was a catastrophic error because the policymakers completely didn't understand the proportions of the epidemic at that time.
Right. By 2010, the group proportions of the crisis were relatively stable. The vast majority of people were addicted to the pills.
And by abruptly taking away the easily abusable pill, they didn't cure the addiction. The users didn't just suddenly get sober.
No, they were thrown into agonizing withdrawal. And they desperately leaped to the next available substitute, which was illicit heroin.
And shortly after that, the Mexican cartels realized the demand had shifted, and they flooded the heroin supply with synthetic fentanyl.
So the reformulation fundamentally shifted the epidemic from a regulated, albeit corrupt, pharmaceutical market straight into a poisoned black market.
The consequences were absolutely apocalyptic. HIV outbreaks from dirty needles skyrocketed, child neglect cases totally overwhelmed the foster system, and fentanyl deaths increased 22-fold.
22-fold. That is just staggering. Powell and Pacula's research suggests a terrifying counterfactual.
Yeah.
Had Purdue just left the highly abusable, crushable pill alone, overdose rates would have likely plateaued and eventually gone down over time as prescribing laws naturally tightened.
Ignorance of how epidemic proportions work literally birthed the fentanyl crisis. It is a masterclass in how a failure to understand the hidden rules of social engineering can destroy a society.
It really is. But, I don't want to leave this deep dive in a place of total despair, because if these rules, overstories, superspreaders, and group proportions, if they can be weaponized for harm, they can also be reverse engineered to build a better world.
Absolutely. We have the power to intentionally rewrite toxic overstories. And one of the most powerful tools for doing that is the cultural zeitgeist.
Pop culture.
Yeah, pop culture and media. Consider how the narrative around the Holocaust shifted in America. Historian Peter Novick pointed out a really startling fact. For decades after World War II, the Holocaust was rarely discussed openly in American culture.
Survivors often kept their trauma completely hidden.
Right. And the American Jewish Committee literally pushed an overstory that downplayed Jewish victimhood. They were terrified of looking weak or alienating the American public during the Cold War.
The overstory was just silence.
But then, in 1978, NBC aired a 4-part miniseries simply titled Holocaust. It starred Meryl Streep and James Woods, and half of the entire American population watched it.
Half the country.
Half the country. That television event was a sledgehammer to the overstory of silence. It gave a generation of survivors permission to finally talk about their trauma openly.
It basically introduced the term Holocaust into the everyday American vernacular.
It fundamentally rewrote the cultural overstory, proving that media and narrative can shift a society's baseline reality almost overnight.
And we saw the exact same mechanism used to break what activists called the isolation rule in the fight for gay marriage.
Yes. In the early 90s, the cultural overstory dictated that gay characters on television were isolated. They were either tragic figures dying of AIDS or they were just punchlines.
The activist Evan Wolfson realized that to change the legal reality of gay marriage, they first had to fundamentally change the cultural overstory.
And the vehicle for that change was a sitcom, Will and Grace.
Will and Grace was revolutionary, not just because the lead character was gay, but because it broke that isolation rule.
Right. Will Truman wasn't a tragic outsider. He was a successful corporate lawyer with a deeply loving, tightly knit community of friends. He was normalized.
Millions of Americans who claimed they didn't know anyone who was gay suddenly spent every Thursday night laughing with Will and Jack in their living rooms.
It perfectly illustrates Damon Santola's 25% rule. Gay marriage activists felt like they were losing the political battle for decades. They were grinding away, suffering defeats.
They were completely unaware that Will and Grace, along with broader cultural shifts, was slowly, invisibly pushing the American public closer and closer to that magic quarter.
When the tipping point finally hit in the 2000s and 2010s, it felt instantaneous. Support for gay marriage skyrocketed overnight. But it wasn't magic. The overstory had been doing the heavy lifting in the background for years.
It reminds us that social change is rarely linear. It bubbles under the surface, reshaping the canopy, altering the proportions, until the math finally tips.
Epidemics, whether they're epidemics of violence, addiction, or profound social progress, they are not passive weather events. They are the sum total of the monocultures we build, the proportions we engineer, the outliers we empower, and the overarching narratives we accept as truth.
Which leaves us with a lot to think about. We've forensically examined LA bank robbers, Vermont tonsils, tragic monocultures, and the boardrooms of Purdue Pharma.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But the real application of this deep dive is looking out your own window. What invisible overstory are we currently living under right now that will seem completely absurd or deeply tragic to historians in 2050?
Right. Are we ignoring a superspreader in our own networks?
And perhaps most importantly, who is quietly trying to shift the magic third in our culture right now, for better or worse, while we aren't paying attention? The rules are always operating. The only question is whether we are the ones writing them or the ones being written out.